I've never been a big fan of the outdoors, but after a stressful few months at work, I thought a solo weekend getaway to a remote cabin might do me some good. I found this place online, cheap, secluded, perfect for hiking. It seemed like the ideal spot to clear my head, at least that's what I thought. The drive there was long and winding, with the last stretch of road practically a dirt trail. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked about how I expected. Small, a little run down, but cozy enough for a couple of nights. It was surrounded by thick woods, no neighbors in sight, just the quiet of nature. I unpacked my stuff, made some coffee, and settled in. There was no cell service, but that was fine by me. I figured I'd use this time to unplug and unwind. The first day was peaceful mostly. I spent it exploring the area around the cabin, walking along the nearby trails. The air was cool, and the trees were thick, their branches hanging low and casting long shadows across the forest floor. It was quiet, almost too quiet. About halfway through my hike, I noticed something strange. Ahead of me, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, there was a man standing perfectly still between the trees. He wasn't hiking, didn't have any gear, he was just standing there, staring off into the distance. I stopped in my tracks, confused. I don't know why, but something about him made me uneasy. He was tall, thin, wearing a faded jacket and dark pants. His head was slightly tilted, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. For a moment I thought about calling out to him, asking if he was okay, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I turned around and headed back to the cabin. I don't know if it was paranoia or what, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched as I walked away. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. But when I finally reached the cabin, the feeling faded, and I convinced myself I was overreacting. I spent the rest of the afternoon inside trying to relax, but my mind kept drifting back to that guy in the woods. Who just stands around like that? Maybe he was lost, or maybe he was camping nearby, but still something about it didn't sit right with me. As night fell, I started to feel more on edge. The isolation that had seemed appealing in the daylight now felt suffocating. I cooked myself a quick dinner, locked the doors, and tried to settle in for the night. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves, that everything was fine. But then, around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps outside the cabin. At first I thought I was imagining it. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin, crunching on the gravel just outside. I couldn't see anything from where I was sitting, but I knew someone was out there. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Whoever it was stopped right outside my window. I didn't dare move. I didn't want to give away that I was inside, even though it was obvious. The lights were on, the car was parked out front. Whoever was out there knew I was in here. I thought about looking out the window, but something in me refused. It was like every instinct I had was screaming not to. I sat there, frozen, waiting for the footsteps to move again. After what felt like hours, they finally did. Slowly they moved away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. But I didn't feel relieved. I just felt more unsettled. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind put me on edge, like the footsteps might start up again at any moment. I kept thinking about the man I saw earlier. Was it him? Had he followed me back? Why would he do that? My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. By the time morning came, I'd had enough. I packed my things as fast as I could and got out of there. I didn't care that I had another night booked, I just needed to leave. The entire drive home, I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. Just the empty road behind me. When I got home, I tried to brush it off as a weird experience, a random encounter, but it's been weeks now, and I still can't shake it. The sound of those footsteps outside my window keeps playing over and over in my head, and the worst part is, I have no idea who or what was out there. Maybe it was just some local messing with me, maybe it was the guy I saw in the woods, but I'll never know for sure. And honestly, that's what scares me the most. Me and 3 of my closest friends, Mark, Dave, and Jason, decided to rent an Airbnb for a relaxing trip. We all needed a break from work and life in general, so when we found this small place in a coastal town, it seemed perfect. The photos of the house online made it look cozy and the price was right, so we booked it without thinking twice. It wasn't exactly in a touristy area, more like a quiet fishing town no one really talks about. But that's what we were going for. Peace and quiet. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The drive out there was long, winding through some dense woods before the road opened up to reveal the ocean. The house was a small cottage, sitting a little ways back from the water, tucked behind a couple of large trees. It wasn't the prettiest place I'd ever seen, but it had a certain charm to it. A bit run down, maybe, but it seemed fine for a couple of nights. The first thing we noticed when we pulled up was how deserted the area was. We didn't see any other cars or people around, and there were only a few other houses scattered along the shore, most of them looking empty. I didn't think much of it at the time. It's a small town after all, and it's not like we were expecting crowds. We unpacked the car, went inside, and settled in. The interior was old, but clean. There were creaky wooden floors and outdated furniture, but again, it was fine. We didn't plan on spending much time inside anyway. That first evening was great. We grilled out back, had a few beers, and just enjoyed the sound of the waves in the distance. Everything was calm, peaceful, like we'd hoped for. But then things started to get weird. It was late, maybe around midnight when we first heard it, this light tapping sound. At first we thought it was one of us messing around, but it wasn't. The tapping came from the windows, like someone gently knocking. We all exchanged looks, not really sure what to make of it. Jason, always the jokester, got up and went to check. He pulled back the curtains and looked out, but there was nothing there. Probably just a branch, he said with a shrug, and we all laughed it off. It was windy outside, so it made sense at the time. The next morning, though, things got stranger. When we stepped outside to head into town, we noticed something odd. There were muddy footprints leading up to the front door. They were smudged, but clear enough to see. The thing is, none of us had been outside since last night, and the shoes didn't match any of ours. They were bigger, like someone with boots had walked up to the house, but the prints didn't lead away. It was as if someone had walked up to the house and just vanished. We joked about it being some prank by the locals. Maybe they liked to mess with the out-of-towners or something. I didn't think much of it at the time. We were in a small town, who knows what kind of weird traditions or jokes they had around there. Still, it was a little unsettling, but we tried to brush it off. That day we explored the town. Not much to see, honestly. A few shops, a diner, and the harbor where fishermen were getting their boats ready. Everyone we came across seemed distant, not unfriendly, but like they didn't care much about us being there. The whole place felt kind of off. I can't really explain it, just a weird vibe, you know? That night, the tapping came back. But this time, it was louder. And it wasn't just one window. It was all around the house. Tap, tap, tap. Every few seconds it moved from one side of the house to the other, like someone was walking around outside, knocking on the windows as they went. We all froze. None of us said anything for a few moments, just listening. Finally, Dave, the most level-headed one in the group, stood up and said we should check it out. We grabbed flashlights and headed outside, but again there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no movement, no cars driving by. Just the sound of the wind and the waves in the distance. Mark pointed out that the footprints from earlier had been washed away by the tide, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. I could see it on everyone's faces, even though no one wanted to admit it. We went back inside, locked the doors, and tried to act like everything was fine. But the tension was thick. We ended up staying awake for hours, too uneasy to sleep. Around 3 a.m., the tapping started again, this time so loud it almost felt like banging. That's when Jason snapped. He jumped up yelling and ran to the door, ready to confront whoever was out there. But when he flung the door open, there was no one there, just the night. No footprints, no signs of anyone around. He stood there for a long time, just staring out into the darkness, while the rest of us stood frozen in the living room, unsure of what to do. We barely slept that night. Every little noise made us jump, and by morning we were all on edge. We decided that we'd had enough and agreed to pack up and leave a day early. The getaway wasn't worth it anymore, something was wrong, and none of us were comfortable staying another night. We threw our stuff in the car as quickly as we could, not bothering to eat breakfast or anything. As we were pulling away from the house, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw it. There was something, standing in the shadow of one of the trees by the house. It was just a figure, tall and still, watching us. I could barely make out any details, but I knew it wasn't one of us. The air felt thick with dread, and I had this overwhelming feeling that we needed to get the hell out of there, fast. "Drive!" I shouted at Mark, who was behind the wheel. He didn't ask questions. He must have sensed it too, because he floored the gas and we sped down the dirt road, leaving the house, the town, and whatever the hell was watching us behind. We didn't stop until we were miles away, back on the highway. No one said a word for the longest time. Finally, Dave broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice shaking. None of us had an answer. Even now, days later, I still don't know what happened that weekend. We've all tried to forget it, to move on, but I can't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us, waiting for us to leave. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't anything supernatural. But whatever it was real. I know that much. I don't think I'll ever go back to that town, and I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe on a trip like that again. Something was wrong with that place, something none of us could explain. My girlfriend Emily and I went on a weekend getaway. We've been dating for about 2 years and we both love the outdoors. Emily found this small, secluded cabin for rent online. It was perfect, cheap, isolated, and surrounded by forests. We figured it would be a great escape from the city for a couple of days. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from where we lived, way up in the mountains. No cell service, no neighbors, just us and nature. It sounded ideal. We left early on Friday and got there around noon. The drive up was nice. The trees were all changing colors, and the air smelled fresh. When we arrived, the cabin was even more secluded than we thought. No one around for miles, it seemed. There was a small lake nearby and a couple of hiking trails that we were excited to explore. The first night was uneventful. We unpacked, made dinner, and relaxed. The silence was actually kind of nice at first. You don't realize how loud the city is until you're somewhere like that, with nothing but the occasional breeze or rustling leaves. We slept well that night, no interruptions. Everything was going fine until the next day. On Saturday morning, we decided to go on a hike. There was this one trail behind the cabin that wasn't on any of the maps we had. It wasn't marked, but it looked like it had been used before, probably by locals or maybe by the people who rented the cabin in the past. We thought, why not? It'd be more fun to explore something off the beaten path. The trail was a little overgrown, but it wasn't too bad. We followed it for a couple of hours, just enjoying the peace and quiet. Emily took pictures along the way, and we talked about how nice it was to be disconnected from everything for a while. That's when we found the car. It was an old sedan. Looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The paint was chipped, the windows were dirty, and there were vines and moss growing all over it. It was just sitting there, in the middle of the woods. No road nearby, nothing. It didn't make sense. We walked up to it, and right away I could tell something was off. The doors were unlocked, and inside were old clothes scattered all over the seats and floor. There were shoes, shirts, pants, even a couple of jackets. It looked like someone had just thrown a bunch of stuff in there and left. Emily kept asking if I thought it was abandoned, but I mean, it had to be, right? There was no way anyone would leave their car like that on purpose. I opened the glove compartment hoping to find something, maybe a registration or something that could tell us more about the car. Instead, I found this old, tattered notebook. The cover was falling apart and the pages were yellowed with age. I flipped through it, and it was full of these frantic scribbled notes. Most of it didn't make any sense. Just words and phrases like, "It's watching, don't stay, get out now." One page had a drawing of the car, or at least something that looked like the car we were standing next to, with arrows pointing away from it. There was no explanation, just these weird ramblings and frantic sketches. It was creepy, but I thought maybe it was just someone messing around trying to scare whoever stumbled upon the car. Emily was spooked though. She wanted to leave right away, and honestly, I didn't argue. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me either. We put the notebook back where I found it, and we started heading back the way we came. That's when things got weird. As we were walking back, I kept getting this strange feeling like we were being watched. I know it sounds paranoid, but it wasn't just in my head. Emily kept looking over her shoulder too, and she wasn't the type to get freaked out easily. Every so often we'd hear a branch snap or some leaves rustle, but every time we stopped to listen, it would go quiet. It felt like someone, or something, was out there with us. The walk back to the cabin felt twice as long as the hike out had. I could feel the tension building between us, but neither of us said anything. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to set. We went inside, locked the door, and tried to brush it off. We made dinner again that night, but neither of us was really hungry. The atmosphere had completely changed. What had started as a peaceful retreat now felt wrong. We sat in silence for most of the evening, both of us jumpy at every little sound. It didn't help that the wind had picked up, causing the trees to creak and the windows to rattle a bit. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes I'd hear something. Footsteps or maybe branches breaking outside. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Emily must have been feeling the same because she kept shifting in bed, restless. By morning, we'd both had enough. We packed up our stuff and left the cabin earlier than planned. Neither of us even mentioned the car or the notebook. It was like we were both pretending it hadn't happened, just to make the whole situation feel less strange. But here's the part that really messes with my head. When we got home, I couldn't stop thinking about that car. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch. So I pulled up a map of the area where we had been hiking. I wanted to see if there were any old roads or trails that led to where we found the car, but no matter how much I looked, I couldn't find anything. The trail we had followed wasn't on any map, and there was no sign of the car or anything like it. I even tried looking at satellite images of the area, just to see if I could spot it, but nothing. It was like the car, the trail, none of it existed. I asked Emily if she remembered anything about the location, but she just shrugged it off, saying we probably got turned around. She hasn't mentioned it since, and I haven't brought it up again either. But here's the thing, there's no way we imagined that car. It was real. We both saw it, touched it, and yet, there's no trace of it anywhere. I don't know what to think anymore. Part of me wants to go back and see if I can find it again, but another part of me knows that's a terrible idea.